The story of Korea in the early 20th century unfolds like a land caught between empires, its mountains standing as silent witnesses to struggle, resilience, and transformation. From 1910 until the closing days of the Second World War in 1945, Korea endured the heavy weight of Japanese colonial rule. Most of its people lived as peasants, tied to the land through subsistence farming, while the forces of industrial change quietly gathered strength in the north. By the 1930s, northern Korea had become an industrial frontier. Mines were carved deep into the earth, hydroelectric dams harnessed powerful rivers, and steel mills roared with relentless energy. Factories expanded rapidly, drawing a growing working class into their orbit, while many Koreans crossed into Manchuria in search of work. Yet this industrial rise stood in sharp contrast to the region's limited agriculture, constrained by rugged terrain and difficult geography. Amid this transformation, ideas from the outside world rarely reached the north. One notable exception was religion. Christian missionaries had established a strong presence, and Pyongyang emerged as a spiritual center, earning the evocative title Jerusalem of the East. Still, beneath this calm surface, resistance quietly intensified. In the mountains and forests, guerrilla fighters carried out a persistent struggle against Japanese authority. Among them rose a determined figure, Kim Il-sung, whose leadership would later shape the destiny of the North. With Japan's defeat in 1945, Korea's fate took a decisive turn. Soviet forces advanced into the north, while American troops occupied the south, dividing the peninsula along the 38th parallel. What began as a temporary arrangement soon hardened into political reality. In the north, Soviet-backed leadership reshaped society, redistributing land, nationalizing industries, and building a new political order under Kim Il-sung. Thus, from colonial subjugation to ideological division, Korea entered a new and uncertain chapter, one that would soon erupt into conflict, forever altering its course. As the dust of liberation settled in the aftermath of the Second World War, Korea found itself not free, but divided, its future entangled in the growing tensions of the emerging Cold War. By September 1947, negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a deadlock. With no agreement in sight, the United States turned to the United Nations, seeking an international solution to the Korean question. The United Nations responded by establishing a temporary commission to oversee nationwide elections. Yet, this effort was immediately undermined. The Soviet Union rejected the plan and denied the commission access to the northern half of the peninsula. As a result, elections were conducted only in the south in May 1948, marking a decisive step toward permanent division. In a final attempt to preserve unity, leaders from both North and South convened in Pyongyang in April 1948. Despite hopes for reconciliation, the conference ended without resolution. The ideological divide had grown too deep, and mistrust overshadowed compromise. Soon after, two separate states formally emerged. In the north, a new constitution was implemented under Soviet guidance, leading to the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the south, the Republic of Korea was proclaimed, gaining recognition from the United Nations as the sole legitimate government of Korea. By 1949, North Korea had consolidated itself into a fully developed communist state. Political power became centralized under the Workers' Party, while all other organizations were absorbed into a unified front controlled by the regime. What had once been a single nation now stood divided, two systems, two governments, and two opposing visions for the future. As the fragile division of Korea hardened into rivalry, the dream of peaceful reunification began to fade into the shadows of Cold War ambition. In the South, Syngman reconsolidated his power with firm authority, backed by American military support, while internal uprisings were forcefully suppressed. For the North, these developments extinguished any lingering hope that revolution might unify the peninsula from within. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung turned his gaze outward. Determined to reunify Korea by force, he sought approval and assistance from powerful allies. Throughout 1949, He traveled repeatedly to Moscow, appealing to Joseph Stalin, while also gaining encouragement from Mao Zedong following the communist victory in China. Initially cautious, Stalin ultimately gave his approval in early 1950, setting into motion a plan that would ignite one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. On June 25, 1950, under the claim of responding to Southern aggression, North Korean forces launched a sweeping offensive across the 38th parallel. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Within days, Seoul fell and the Southern government fled in disarray. The Northern Army, battle-hardened and equipped with Soviet weaponry, pushed relentlessly southward, forcing American and South Korean troops into a desperate defensive stand at the Pusan perimeter. Yet the tide of war would soon shift. In September 1950, under the bold leadership of Douglas MacArthur, United Nations forces executed a daring amphibious landing at Incheon. Seoul was recaptured, and the momentum reversed. UN troops surged northward, advancing toward the Chinese border. But victory proved fleeting. In late November, Chinese forces entered the war in massive numbers, driving UN troops back in a powerful counteroffensive. Pyongyang and Seoul changed hands once more, as the conflict settled into a brutal stalemate. For 2 years, the war raged with unrelenting intensity, trenches carved into hills, artillery echoing across valleys, and skies filled with relentless bombing. The human and material cost was catastrophic. Vast areas of North Korea were reduced to ruins under sustained aerial bombardment. Cities were flattened, infrastructure shattered, and entire populations displaced. In response, North Koreans retreated underground, rebuilding their society beneath the surface. By 1953, the economy had nearly collapsed. Amid the devastation, negotiations dragged on. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed, ending open hostilities. Yet no peace treaty followed. The war had ceased, but the division endured, leaving Korea suspended in a tense and unresolved silence that echoes to this day. In the shadow of war's end, as the guns fell silent but tensions endured, a new struggle unfolded within North Korea, not on battlefields, but in the corridors of power. Kim Il-sung, already elevated by war and revolution, now moved with careful precision to consolidate his authority over a state still shaped by competing revolutionary voices. In the early years, North Korea's political landscape was far from unified. For major factions competed for influence: Soviet-trained Koreans, Chinese-returned revolutionaries, domestic communists led by Pak Han-yong, and Kim's own guerrilla supporters from the anti-Japanese struggle. But unity was short-lived. After the Korean War, Pak Han-yong was accused of catastrophic failure, blamed for the South's lack of uprising. Stripped of power, he was executed following a highly orchestrated trial, marking a chilling sign of what dissent would cost. By 1956, the transformation of the ruling party was unmistakable. A new generation, younger and more loyal, replaced the old leadership. That same year, a shockwave rippled through the communist world when Nikita Khrushchev denounced the legacy of Joseph Stalin. Inspired by this, critics within North Korea briefly challenged Kim's growing authoritarianism. Their fate was swift. In what became known as the August Faction Incident, Kim purged his opponents, erasing them from positions of power and often from history itself. Reports from defectors and diplomats painted a grim picture. Prisons filled with thousands accused of trivial or fabricated offenses. Agricultural policies were enforced harshly, leading to suffering and despair among peasants. Meanwhile, Kim's image grew ever larger, both literally and symbolically. By the late 1960s, even decorated military leaders were not immune. Those who questioned Kim's ideology of self-reliance, known as Juche, were removed as enemies of the state. What emerged was not merely a government, but a system built on absolute loyalty. As the years passed, Kim Il-sung was no longer just a leader. He became the great leader, a near mythical figure. His cult of personality expanded, intertwining his family into a revolutionary lineage. In 1972, this elevation was cast in bronze with the unveiling of the towering Mansa Hill statue, an enduring symbol of power, reverence, and control. Like Mao in China, Kim Il-sung refused to accept Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin and continued to model his regime on Stalinist norms. At the same time, he increasingly stressed Korean independence, as embodied in the concept of juche. Relations with China had worsened during the war. Mao Zedong criticized Kim for having started the whole idiotic war and for being an incompetent military commander who should have been removed from power. PLA commander Peng Dehuai was equally contemptuous of Kim's skills at waging war. By some analysis, Kim Il-sung remained in power partially because the Soviets turned their attention to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that fall. The Soviets and Chinese were unable to stop the inevitable purge of Kim's domestic opponents or his move towards a one-man Stalinist autocracy, and relations with both countries deteriorated in the former's case because of the elimination of the pro-Soviet Koreans and the latter because of the regime's refusal to acknowledge Chinese assistance in either liberation from the Japanese or the war in 1950-1953. Beginning in the late 1950s, North Korea and China began renegotiating their border, culminating in the 1962 Sino-North Korean Border Treaty and a 1964 companion that established the modern border between the two countries. Tensions between North and South escalated in the late 1960s with a series of low-level armed clashes known as the Korean DMZ conflict. In 1966, Kim declared liberation of the South to be a national duty. In 1968, North Korean commandos launched the Blue House Raid, an unsuccessful attempt to assassinate the South Korean President Park Chung-hee. Shortly after, the U.S. spy ship Pueblo was captured by the North Korean Navy. The crew were held captive throughout the year despite American protests that the vessel was in international waters, and they were finally released in December after a formal U.S. apology was issued. In April 1969, a North Korean fighter jet shot down an EC-121 aircraft, killing all 31 crewmen on board. The Nixon administration found itself unable to react at all, since the U.S. was heavily committed in the Vietnam War and had no troops to spare if the situation in Korea escalated. However, the Pueblo capture and EC-121 shoot-down did not find approval in Moscow, as the Soviet Union did not want a second major war to erupt in Asia. China's response to the USS Pueblo crisis is less clear. After Khrushchev was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev as Soviet leader in 1964, and with the incentive of Soviet aid, North Korea strengthened its ties with the USSR. Kim condemned China's Cultural Revolution as unbelievable idiocy. In turn, China's Red Guards labeled him a fat revisionist. In 1972, the first formal summit meeting between Pyongyang and Seoul was held, but the cautious talks did not lead to a lasting change in the relationship. With the fall of South Vietnam to the North Vietnamese on April 30, 1975, Kim Il-sung felt that the U.S. had shown its weakness and that reunification of Korea under his regime was possible. Kim visited Beijing in May 1975 in the hope of gaining political and military support for this plan to invade South Korea again, but Mao Zedong refused. Despite public proclamations of support, Mao privately told Kim that China would be unable to assist North Korea because of the lingering after-effects of the Cultural Revolution throughout China, and because Mao had recently decided to restore diplomatic relations with the U.S. Meanwhile, North Korea emphasized its independent orientation by joining the non-aligned movement in 1975. It promoted juche as a model for developing countries to follow. It developed strong ties with the regimes of Bokassa in the Central African Republic, Messias Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, Idi Amin in Uganda, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Gaddafi in Libya, and Ceausescu in Romania. In the silent aftermath of war, amid shattered cities and scorched fields, a nation began to rebuild itself from ruin. North Korea, scarred yet unbroken, turned toward an ambitious reconstruction, one driven by discipline, ideology, and external support. Assistance flowed in from powerful allies, while skilled Koreans, shaped by years of industrial experience under foreign rule, stepped forward to restore what had been lost. The land itself was transformed. Between 1953 and 1958, sweeping collectivization reshaped agriculture. Fields once owned by individuals were merged into collective farms, and the old class of landlords had largely vanished, either displaced by reform or consumed by the chaos of war. Yet this transformation came at a cost. Misreporting of harvests by local officials triggered a devastating famine in 1954-55. As the state claimed its share, hunger tightened its grip on the countryside, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Despite these hardships, the state pressed forward. Massive investments poured into heavy industry, infrastructure, and military strength, while consumer needs were set aside. Central planning became the engine of growth. The idea of self-reliance, known as juche, emerged as both philosophy and necessity, guiding national policy. Mass mobilization campaigns swept across the country. Workers and farmers were urged to exceed limits, to build faster, produce more, and embody revolutionary zeal. By the late 1950s, industry stood fully nationalized, and even taxation on agriculture was eventually abolished. The nation adopted a constant state of vigilance, balancing economic development with military preparedness. Factories rose where ruins once stood, electricity reached homes, schools filled with children, and universities multiplied. By the 1970s, North Korea stood as an industrialized command economy, its rapid transformation described by some observers as nothing short of miraculous. From devastation to discipline, its story became one of relentless reconstruction under a singular vision. By the 1970s, North Korea's economic ascent and the rise in living standards had plateaued. The regime's ambition to assert independence from Chinese and Soviet aid drove massive investment in military industries, financed largely through foreign borrowing. The government envisioned covering these costs by exporting its mineral wealth and acquiring advanced industrial infrastructure from abroad. Entire factories, spanning petrochemicals, textiles, steel, concrete, pulp, and paper, were imported from the developed world, including a Japanese-Danish collaboration that delivered the largest cement plant on Earth. Yet the 1973 global oil crisis and falling mineral prices left North Korea saddled with enormous debt, forcing a halt to repayments by 1985 and curtailing its ability to acquire new foreign technology. While the capitalist world surged ahead in computers, electronics, and advanced industries, North Korea remained locked in its Stalinist focus on mining and steel, and urban migration stagnated. In October 1980, Kim Jong Un was publicly introduced as Kim Il-sung's successor, having already established himself as a leading theorist with the 1972 publication of On the Juche Idea. By 1974, his succession was officially confirmed. The 1980s were marked by bold, sometimes violent gestures. The 1983 Rangoon bombing, a failed assassination attempt against South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan, alarmed the Third World and strained diplomatic ties. Kim Jong-il embarked on a grand tour of the USSR and Eastern Europe in 1984, solidifying Soviet support, which peaked at $2.8 billion in bilateral trade by 1988. Yet provocations continued, including the 1987 bombing of Korean Air Flight 858, which placed North Korea on the U.S. list of terrorist states. Despite mounting economic strain, the regime invested in monumental projects, the Juche Tower, Nampo Dam, and Ryugyong Hotel, and hosted the 13th World Festival of Youth and Students in 1989, showcasing its personality cult. Meanwhile, the fall of the Eastern Bloc and Gorbachev's reforms intensified Pyongyang's isolation. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union deprived North Korea of its key ally, plunging the economy into crisis. By the early 1990s, Kim Jong-il had assumed de facto control of the state, overseeing the army and national defense, while international tensions over nuclear ambitions escalated. culminating in Jimmy Carter's 1994 intervention to temporarily ease the crisis. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung, the architect of North Korea's modern state, died suddenly of a heart attack, marking the end of an era and the beginning of Kim Jong Il's consolidated rule. The political landscape of the final years of Kim Il-sung closely mirrored the early period of his son's leadership, underscoring continuity in governance amidst turbulence. The economy, already faltering by 1990, plunged into crisis. Between 1990 and 1995, foreign trade halved, and the loss of subsidized Soviet oil struck a devastating blow. Floods in 1995 ravaged crops and infrastructure, precipitating a famine that would claim countless lives until 1998. Yet, remarkably, internal opposition remained muted. Even those who fled to China often maintained loyalty to the regime, many returning after earning enough to survive. In September 1998, Kim Il-sung was proclaimed eternal president, and the office of the presidency was abolished, a symbolic testament to North Korea's unique theocratic governance, where the personality cult confers posthumous authority. Powers formerly held by the president were distributed among the premier, the head of the Supreme People's Assembly, and Kim Jong-il as supreme commander and chairman of the National Defense Commission. Through his military posts, he emphasized the army as both a source and symbol of power, formalizing the Sungun, or military first, policy, which prioritized the Korean People's Army in national affairs. The turn of the millennium saw intensifying tensions. While South Korea's Kim Dae-jung sought rapprochement through the Sunshine Policy, North Korea pursued nuclear capabilities, detonating its first underground bomb in 2006 and developing ICBMs. Diplomatic agreements, such as the 2007 Six-Party Accord, failed to halt progress. Skirmishes in 2010, including the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, underscored a regime willing to wield military might to assert its dominance and secure its survival. On December 17, 2011, Kim Jong-il, the long-standing ruler of North Korea, passed away, and his son, Kim Jong Un, ascended to power. The new leadership swiftly consolidated authority, exemplified by the arrest and execution of Kim's uncle, Jang Song-thaek, in 2013, and the alleged purge of some 300 officials. Human rights concerns deepened, culminating in the 2014 United Nations Commission of Inquiry report accusing the regime of crimes against humanity. North Korea charted a path of both symbolic and strategic assertion. In 2015, it adopted Pyongyang's Standard Time, realigning temporally with its historical identity. The 7th Congress of the Workers' Party in 2016 heralded a midterm economic development plan, the first in 24 years. By 2017, North Korea demonstrated its military might, testing the Hwasong-15 intercontinental missile and amassing a nuclear arsenal estimated at 15 to 60 bombs. Diplomacy took center stage in 2018. High-level delegations to the Winter Olympics, inter-Korean summits, and historic meetings with U.S. President Donald Trump marked unprecedented engagement, though subsequent talks faltered. The regime also implemented stringent COVID-19 containment measures from 2020, reportedly achieving notable success by 2024. In early 2021, Kim Jong Un was restored as General Secretary of the Workers' Party, cementing his authority. By January 2024, he signaled a dramatic policy shift away from inter-Korean cooperation, symbolically demolishing the arch of reunification, underscoring a return to assertive, unilateral governance.